Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a closer look at a really big global story that's still unfolding, one that carries some pretty significant implications for economies and, well, alliances around the world. We're diving into the recent trade agreement announced between the United States and the European Union. And for this, we're drawing on a few key sources: a YouTube transcript of the official announcement, a detailed piece from the New York Times, and also an in-depth analysis report on the deal itself. Our mission really is to unpack what was actually agreed upon, get a sense of the, intense negotiations that led up to it, maybe dissect some of the immediate impacts, and think about what this means for global trade going forward. We'll try to give you those aha moments, maybe some surprising facts you can connect. Okay, let's get into it. So, picture this. It's late Sunday night, July 27th, 2025. The clock's ticking. High stakes. You've got U.S. President Donald Trump and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen meeting privately, and the backdrop is this looming threat of a transatlantic trade war. Then, bam, reportedly in under an hour, they strike a deal, which sounds incredibly fast, but I guess that speed kind of hides months of really intense bargaining, right?
Oh, absolutely. It does. And what's really striking here is just how close, really close, we were to that trade war actually happening. Remember, just before this deal, on July 12th, President Trump had explicitly threatened 30% tariffs on EU imports. That was the threat if an agreement wasn't reached by that Friday deadline.
Right. And wasn't that even lower than an earlier threat?
It was. He'd previously hinted at maybe even 50%. So 30% was already a step back, but still, a huge threat.
And the EU wasn't just passively waiting, were they? They had their own plans.
Not at all. Brussels was ready. They'd prepared quite a robust retaliatory package just in case the talks collapsed. We're talking something like 90 billion euros, which is roughly 109 billion US dollars, targeting all sorts of US goods, things like car parts, bourbon, you name it. Yeah, so this readiness on both sides, it really underscores the seriousness of the brinkmanship strategy that was being played. President Trump, for his part, kept justifying the tariff threats. He talked about reducing what he called a, quote, very one-sided transaction, very unfair to the United States. And of course, trimming that U.S. trade deficit with the EU, which was around $235.6 billion in 2024.
So it sounds like this deal wasn't so much about, proactively finding mutual benefits, but more like a reactive scramble to de-escalate a crisis that was about to boil over. Is that fair?
I think that's a very accurate way to describe it, yes. It was classic bondmanship, really, pushing your trading partner right to the edge, the verge of economic conflict, to force concessions. And the key thing here is the EU, despite having their own countermeasures ready, their ultimate acceptance of new tariffs shows that avoiding that full-scale trade war was clearly the paramount objective for them.
Okay, so with all that intense background, let's pull back the curtain a bit. What are the actual specifics? What did they agree on, especially with those tariffs?
Right, the core. Well, a central piece is this new 15% tariff. It applies to most goods going from the EU to the US. Think big sectors: automobiles, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals. Now, yeah, it's lower than the threatened 30%, but it's still a massive jump from where things were. The average US tariff on EU stuff was only about 1.5% at the end of 2024.
Just 1.5%.
Yeah. So 15% is significant. President von der Leyen actually called this 15% a clear ceiling, sort of indicating, that's the limit.
But it wasn't 15% across the board, was it? I remember reading about some exceptions, like 0 tariffs.
That's right. There's a specific list, quite strategic, of products where the tariffs go to 0 on both sides. This includes things like all aircraft and their parts, certain chemicals, some generic drugs, semiconductor equipment specifically, some farm products, and natural resources. Interestingly, the status of alcohol in that 0 category, that remains a bit unclear based on the reports. But this dual structure, 15% for most things, 0 for these selected items, it really points towards a very selective, managed trade deal. It's not broad free trade. It seems designed to benefit specific U.S. export areas. And from the U.S. side, President Trump claimed that in return for the EU accepting that 15% tariff, the EU would be, quote, opening up their countries at 0 tariff for American exports.
Okay.
And maybe even more critically, the U.S. Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, he emphasized that the EU would, quote, completely accept our auto and industrial standards for the first time ever.
The non-tariff barriers. That's huge.
Exactly. That's a massive strategic win if it holds. Addressing those standards differences could potentially unlock the EU's, $20 trillion market for American firms in a way tariffs alone don't capture.
Now, beyond tariffs and standards, there were some pretty eye-popping financial commitments made by the EU too, weren't there?
Oh, absolutely. Huge numbers. The EU agreed to buy about $750 billion worth of U.S. energy over the next 3 years.
750 billion.
Yep. That breaks down to an extra $250 billion in U.S. energy products each year from 2025 through 2027. A big part of the motivation there, reportedly, is to reduce Europe's reliance on Russian natural gas.
Makes sense.
On top of that, the EU committed to investing an additional $600 billion in the U.S. beyond what they already invest. And then there's a major purchase of U.S. military equipment valued at hundreds of billions of dollars. That's also in the deal.
Wow, so this really goes way beyond just tweaking import taxes.
It really does. These huge financial commitments, they elevate this way beyond a normal trade deal. They look like pretty substantial economic concessions that line up with broader U.S. strategic goals. It really shows how the U.S. seemed to use that trade pressure to achieve foreign policy aims to min. Boosting the U.S. defense industry, pushing European energy security towards the U.S. It does raise a question, doesn't it? Is this a new template for using economic leverage for strategic goals?
That's a fascinating point. But while we have this new structure, some existing U.S. tariffs on EU goods didn't change, right? They stayed put.
Correct. Good point. For example, those U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum, the ones President Trump had set quite high, like 50%, on many countries, those are not being cut for the EU. And that decision has apparently, quote, dashed the hopes of industry in the bloc, who are hoping for relief there.
I bet.
Conversely, aerospace tariffs, they're staying at zero for now. So it shows the U.S. is still protecting sectors it sees as strategically vital or maybe vulnerable.
Okay, so we've got the deal's components. What about the reaction? What does this all mean on the ground for businesses, economies, political ties? How did people actually take this news on both sides of the Atlantic?
Well, President Trump, he definitely framed it as a massive win. He called it the biggest deal ever made, said it would be great for both parties, bring everyone closer together. He really hammered that theme of fairness in trade and the opening up of Europe for U.S. exporters. Right, very triumphant language. In contrast, you had President von der Leyen. While she acknowledged Trump as a tough negotiator and deal maker, her emphasis was different. She said the deal would bring stability and predictability, which she stressed was very important for our businesses.
Stability and predictability. Okay, less about winning, more about managing.
Exactly. She defended it as an effort to sort of rebalance the trade surplus with the U.S. She described the meeting itself as very difficult, but ultimately good and satisfactory. So you see the difference. Trump claims a clear victory. Von der Leyen stresses averting disaster and finding some stability.
But beneath that top-level EU reaction, the responses from individual member states were, well, quite varied, weren't they? Seemed to reveal some cracks.
Oh, definitely. Big divisions. Take Germany. Chancellor Merz, he welcomed the deal. He emphasized that it averted an unnecessary escalation and acknowledged a trade war would have really hurt Germany's export-heavy economy. He specifically noted the tariff on German cars coming down from a potential 27.5% to the agreed 15%, so relief there.
But that wasn't the only German voice, was it?
Not by a long shot. You had Wolfgang Niedermark from the Federation of German Industries, the BDI. He called the deal an inadequate compromise.
Yeah.
He argued that even the 15% tariff would have a huge negative impact on German industry. And he pointed out that a major German car maker, Volkswagen, had already seen profits tumble because of earlier tariff issues. So a real split even within Germany.
And other countries were even less happy.
Some were much more critical, yes. French Prime Minister François Bayrou, for instance, he strongly condemned it, called it a dark day for Europe. He argued the EU had essentially caved in to the U.S. with an unbalanced deal, calling it a submission. Strong words.
Wow. Submission.
Yeah.
That's blunt.
Very. And the Netherlands Foreign Trade Minister, Hanneke Boerma, she also found the deal not ideal. Ireland expressed regrets over the 15% baseline. This kind of fragmented response, these internal EU divisions especially, reportedly, Germany's strong desire to protect its car industry. These were apparently weaknesses exploited during the negotiations. It paints a picture of a bloc under pressure and not entirely united.
So, okay, trade war averted check. But the deal still means a net economic cost for Europe, right? Their industries have to adjust to this new 15% reality for many goods. Seems like a bittersweet outcome for the EU, maybe?
That seems a very fair way to put it. Bloomberg Economics did an estimate suggesting that without any deal, the effective U.S. tariff rate on EU goods could have jumped to almost 18%. This deal brings it down to around 16%. So yes, it's better than the worst case scenario, but only a small reprieve, as they put it, for European exporters. Meanwhile, from the U.S. viewpoint, this deal is largely seen as validating President Trump's aggressive brinkmanship tactics. It reinforces that whole America First foreign policy approach.
Okay, so this agreement is significant, clearly, but it feels like maybe it's not the absolute final chapter. What happens next? Where does this deal go from here, and what might it signal for U.S.-EU trade relations long term?
Right, crucial question. First off, it's really important to remember this announced deal is, right now, more of a political framework. It's not yet a fully ratified, legally binding agreement. The European Commission now has to take this framework and present it to all the EU member states and to the EU lawmakers. They hold the ultimate power to approve or reject it.
Ah, so it still has to go through the formal EU process.
Exactly. Every single EU member state has to formally ratify it before it take full effect. And given those mixed reactions we just talked about, well, there's still significant uncertainty there. Lots of details still need to be hammered out in the coming weeks.
So not quite a done deal. There's still wiggle room, maybe even potential for it to unravel slightly, depending on those internal EU politics. What about the future within the deal itself?
Well, one potentially important part is that both sides did commit to, quote, keep working to add more products to this list of zero for zero tariffs.
Okay, so it could evolve.
It suggests a possible pathway, yeah. Maybe for gradual sector-by-sector liberalization beyond just this initial setup. But it also implies we're looking at more prolonged, ongoing negotiations, not some final resolution of all the trade friction. It's not like, okay, we fixed it, let's move on.
And stepping back, looking at the bigger picture, this whole deal happening in July 2025, it fits very neatly into President Trump's broader America First foreign policy. You know, the pattern of using tariffs increases and pauses and having very transactional relationships, even with traditional allies.
Right, it's not happening in a vacuum. Precisely. It aligns with other preliminary pacts the U.S. has signed under this administration with Japan, the U.K., others. The overall trajectory seems to be a continued shift away from the established multilateral trade systems like the WTO towards a more fragmented, perhaps less predictable global trade environment. Allies seem consistently pressured to sort of rebalance their relationships in ways that favor U.S. interests, often, as we saw here, through pretty significant economic leverage.
Okay, we have certainly covered a lot of ground today. We've unpacked this U.S.-EU trade agreement, looked at the really intense tensions that led up to it, the specific commitments, tariffs, investments, energy, even military purchases, and those diverse, sometimes quite critical reactions across Europe. It seems like a deal aimed at stability, but one that definitely came with costs and some complex internal dynamics for the EU.
I think that sums it up well. The agreement did avert a full-blown trade war, which was, clearly a top priority for the EU, but it just as clearly reflects the effectiveness, from the U.S. perspective, of that brinkmanship strategy and the underlying America First agenda. And the implication seems to be that this philosophy, this approach, will likely keep driving future interactions, which could lead to a more protectionist, maybe more unpredictable, international economic order overall.
So here's maybe a final thought for you, our listeners, to chew on as you see this unfold further. Given this reliance on brinkmanship and considering those mixed, sometimes really negative reactions from within the EU itself, how might this specific deal shape future trade negotiations? Not just between the US and EU, but between other major global powers too. Does it set a kind of new precedent for how international economic relationships are hammered out, or maybe even how they fracture? Something to definitely mull over next time you see a headline about trade talks. We certainly hope this deep dive has given you a clearer understanding of this really major global event. Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep asking those questions.